the fourth European state. Right now, 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are European countries, and 3 of the 5, and those 3 are all former great powers. This actually is probably something that will not be no longer the case in 100 years, and probably even less. But how do we make the change? And I think the UN will be, you cannot have an effective United Nations whose fundamental constitution reflects what even by the standards of 60 years ago was the courtesy admission of France to the Security Council. And so, I agree with you, Yannick, that one needs to be proactive here. I'm not sure that Europeans have yet, as a group, come to terms with the need to develop a joint strategy for the reduction of Europe's footprint in global institutions.
I totally agree with you. You don't even have to go that far. They haven't agreed on something that is fundamental, and I think is a preliminary step to contemplating their future and the future of the Western community, which is their relation with Russia. As a matter of fact,
yep.
I organized last week in Washington a talk with US policymakers, Europeans, and corporate executives as well, a little seminar on Western-Russian relations. One of the most striking elements of the discussions were the fact that we have to sort of, this is some kind of an agreement on a wide array of issues, but the misperceptions and the chain reactions of misaction, misperceptions, defiance, suspicion, and so on, we know all that defines Western-Russian relations, all about defined them for 15 years, is the most important impediment to enacting a vision of what the future of relation between Russians, Europeans, Western Europeans, or EU, and the US ought to be, because that is a preliminary step towards tackling the issues you've just mentioned. So we sort of agree from different angles.
Let me ask, how much does the United States or Barack Obama right now need Western Europe or Europe in dealing with Iran? You talked, Walter, you alluded to an effective United Nations. I thought you were going to put the period at one point in the sentence, but you didn't and continue. I'm not sure that I've seen an effective United Nations. It certainly has not been effective in dealing with the Iran problem. So to what extent, I mean, China is a problem. Russia is a problem in dealing with Iran. So you're Barack Obama, you're sitting in the Situation Room, you're surrounded by all of your advisors. Where does he turn? How much does he need Western Europe in dealing with what is a potentially very, very serious problem, which some people have said if retaliatory action is taken, you basically could have a conflagration in the Middle East?
Well, I think, again, I think for Barack Obama, really the core question is, in his own mind, that he has to answer is, which is worse, an Iranian nuclear weapon or a US-Iranian conflict? I think we all hope and pray that sanctions and diplomacy might avoid that stark choice. But I think there are not many people out there who are very hopeful that we will be spared that choice. If I had to guess what the president is thinking, and I don't know, I would guess that he thinks that the military conflict is worse and that his instincts would lead him to want to find a path to contain Iran through developing closer relations with Arab countries and so on and so forth. If that's his course, or Western European support is of great importance if there's going to be a war with Iran. But we probably won't get it.
But wouldn't it also be
and if you're well, I'm saying if you think that sanctions will really work, then Western Europe is important. But I just suggested I don't think anybody really thinks that the solution to this crisis will come from effective sanctions on Iran. I think people think that that's something that one does while one plays out the larger question of how to deal with it. So in that sense, a lot of the discussion between the US and Western European countries is about something symbolic rather than, not that, again, I'm not a neoconservative and symbolism is empty, we shouldn't deal with it, but it's something of a second order issue. And that when Obama sits down and asks himself, which is worse, a bomb or a war, I actually doubt that his relations with Western Europe are a big factor in that, or rather that the possibility of getting support from Western Europe in a war is one that is a significant factor in his thinking.
But you're assuming that bomb just sits in a warehouse somewhere.
Well, again, I'm not making any. I think again, if the core policy question, I think, is one that an Obama administration will think it needs to be made by the president sitting in the Oval Office. And then in terms of how do you implement whatever it is that you want to do, you begin to work with your friends and allies, and your enemies for that matter. But I'm not, it's hard to see, Europe out of its own interests, regardless of the state of its relations with the U.S., will try to be on the side of making sure that if the Iranians have a bomb, they don't slip little ones to various terror groups and so on. Just as even at the worst moments of U.S.-European relations in the Bush administration, the very close counterintelligence, counterterrorism cooperation actually significantly deepened, even as these spats went on.
Yeah, I think, take your example, when it is a matter of war and peace, I think presidents decide with their own conscience. I think Chirac didn't take too much into account the future of U.S.-American relations, Franco-American relations, sorry, when he had to decide whether, between the two options, whether a war or just elusive weapons of mass destruction at the time. Yeah. So it's a bit of the same thing. I'd say, though, that I agree with you that it seems probably that the war is the worst option. Obama thinks the war is the worst option. He would still need the Europeans, but above all, he would need the Russians. And in that sense, we go back to the question that I've raised before, which is the triangle relationship between Russia, Europe, and the US. In that sense, the missile defense decision to just abandon the plan, I think, is comforting. We'll see what the payback, so to speak, because obviously there will be a payback. We will see that in the wording of possible sanctions at the Security Council that will be supported by Russia. But as far as the heart of the matter is concerned, I'd say that it's more the sustainability, the future of the regime, and perhaps the hope, perhaps a vain hope, to accompany with European diplomacy and great Russian support a softening step by step of the regime in Iran, a transformation of that regime that is totally exhausted and completely divided. It's very complicated to find the real nucleus of power in the Iranian regime beyond the supreme guide. There are other interests at stakes, and in particular the economic interests of the ruling elite that makes business and who's probably opening up to the West and to America in particular would be detrimental to them. So that's an internal impediment that should not be overlooked. So I think it's more thinking about the future of the regime and what we can do together to sort of shift it towards something more amenable or more acceptable than the bomb itself. The real issue is the bomb. The real issue is terrorism. It's not Iran, it's Pakistan, which is extremely difficult to solve, where the Europeans have very little influence. And a war with Iran would be a disaster for 1,000 years, given the situation in the Middle East. And you cannot isolate too much the problem. You have to have I'd say a regional approach to it. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and American relations with Israel, and the question of the settlements that the president himself has raised as the most difficult obstacle to any kind of progress in the peace negotiations, if negotiations there are.
I would also just throw in another place where U.S.-EU relations could be important and could be vulnerable, and that would be the question of Turkey. Because I think it's, to my mind, it's fairly likely that if Iran has a bomb at some point in the not too distant future, Turkey would also move in that direction. And if you add to that the sense that we get both from France and Germany that Turkey's road to membership in the EU is blocked,